I'm Nahlah Ayed, host of CBC Ideas. This federal election campaign has been overshadowed by one overarching issue. How do we as Canadians deal with Donald Trump? That has left little space to discuss other important matters like how do we revitalize our democracy? In our series, Ideas for a Better Canada, we held public discussions in 4 cities in search of local ideas that can inspire national change. Nanaimo, British Columbia, on the east coast of Vancouver Island, has a storied past as a coal mining and industry town. Now it's a destination for young professionals and workers, a place to start a family, a career, a business, surrounded by stunning natural beauty. But growth brings challenges, some of them severe. Like many cities in Canada, Nanaimo has a housing crisis. Our first guest today is a colleague of mine and, of course, a familiar voice to many of you who listen to the radio, Gregor Craigie from CBC Radio on Vancouver Island. Some of you may not know this, but the other thing that Gregor has done is he's the author of a new book called Our Crumbling Foundation, How We Solve Canada's Housing Crisis. Did you? Yeah, I was surprised too. I don't know where you find the time. But I am curious, from the perch that you have, the host chair in the morning, what is your sense of the scale of the problem, the housing crisis here on this island?
It's huge, and it has become not just a Vancouver downtown east side problem. It's spread to cities and towns, big and small, across this province and across this country. The first time I became aware of what I think is the housing crisis was actually in 1996, when I moved from Alberta, where I grew up, to Vancouver, and I started working a year later as a reporter, and I walked through the downtown east side, which is very familiar to so many, and I was staggered by the social issues and the homelessness and all the rest of it, but it has been growing ever since. It's not just Vancouver, it's not just Victoria, it's not just Nanaimo, it's Duncan, it's Kamloops, it's Abbotsford, it's across this country. In my book, I talk about very small towns in Nova Scotia that are now having this crisis. So from my perch, Nahlah, it is fundamentally affecting the health and the stability of our communities at every level, because even if, like me, you're housed, you own your own home, the people around you are facing more and more friction. And I originally wanted to call this book A Crack in the Foundation, but it took me about a week of research to realize, no, it is crumbling.
So when you wrote this book, obviously you were looking for solutions and you went far and wide looking for solutions. I'm wondering to what extent you found that really ultimately the final answer was just more supply.
I do think the final answer is more supply. However, I don't think it's just a simple problem of supply and demand, because there are so many questions about what constricts supply and what increases demand. But I found no silver bullet, Nahlah. I think dozens of changes are needed across this country. If I found anywhere around the world that I thought came closest to us, I actually think it was Paris, where they have enacted a raft of changes, financing, borrowing, quotas for housing construction, infill, making free public land, improving transportation, on and on. They have taken a city with an affordability problem and a lack of housing and turned it around significantly. But even then, there's still so many differences. So the short answer is there is no simple one answer, and we need to make dozens of changes now, or it will not get better.
Okay. And so I want to actually bring in someone else into the conversation. Michael McKenzie is the Jaroslawski Chair in Trust and Political Leadership at Vancouver Island University. He studies trust in the democratic process, ethics in governance and leadership, and political decision-making, both long and short-term. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Here's a sort of a deceivingly simple question, but an important one. What is the relationship between access to housing and democracy?
Well, I think it is a complex question. If we think about democracy broadly as what we do when we're trying to live together with other people, in particular, other people who disagree, and we always will disagree. We always disagree when we live with people, whether it's in a small group, when we're living with family or roommates, or whether we're living in a province of 4 million people or a country of 40 million people, we will disagree, and we have to figure out how to navigate that together. And when we do that in democratic ways, we treat other people like people. When we do it in undemocratic ways, we treat people like objects to be moved or manipulated. And so if we think about democracy in that broad sense, how do we live in a community with other people and navigate through our disagreements? And housing is fundamental.
But we claim to have a democracy. So what kind of democracy allows for that kind of leaving behind of people, as you say, and treating them like objects?
Well, it means that certain people within our democracies are not participating in our communities. And it's much harder to participate in our communities if you don't have the basic necessities of life. I think that's a very, very high obstacle to get over. And also, frankly, it's not going to be your first priority, is it?
Who speaks for you in society when you're busy working and making a living?
Well, in a democracy, we want people to have opportunities to speak for themselves or to speak through their representatives who understand their problems and their issues. But when there's a large population of people who are not actively involved in our community life, they often don't get well represented, and they're not going to be well represented because people don't understand their issues, their problems, their interests, their perspectives, their material needs. And if they're not in a position to participate themselves or to elect representatives who do understand those perspectives and needs, those perspectives and needs just aren't going to be considered properly. They're not going to be first priority needs. And I think we see that.
What's really interesting about you, Michael, I thought, is that the fact that you, among your many areas of study, one is intergenerational relations. And so I'm curious, you know, we all know, of course, that older and retired Canadians, not all, but often they are far more likely to be homeowners than younger people. And I'm wondering if you could speak to how that generational divide affects the health of democracy.
Yeah, well, as we know, housing and property ownership is a very important component of intergenerational wealth transfer. So when you own a home, you have a property that tends to retain its value, and as we've seen in many communities, the value of properties are actually going up, and that's a bit of security. And it also means you can pass on wealth to your children. And if you don't buy into the market, if you don't have that opportunity, if you didn't come from a family who had that opportunity in the past, you're very far behind economically. And so this is a real divide. And we may be getting into if we're not already there, into a situation where our society is like two different societies, as Gregor was saying. There's people who own their properties and have wealth to transfer to the next generation, and people who don't. And that's not sustainable for a democracy.
Here's the other thing, Michael. You know, the housing crisis, whether it's here or anywhere in this country, is something that has been brewing for years. It's a long-term problem. It's going to take years to solve, if ever. And I'm wondering, again, looking at how our democratic system works, how equipped is it to deal with these kinds of long-term problems?
So this is a great question. I like to say that there's no such thing as a short-term issue. When I was researching this and I was writing a book on future regarding governance, I thought, well, you know, I'd better identify an issue that is not a long-term one so we know what we're talking about. I couldn't think of a short-term issue. All issues have long-term consequences, and they have long-term causes. And all issues have costs and benefits that are distributed through time in various complex ways. And so the housing crisis that we're facing now is really decades in the making. It's decades in the making. It's complex. It's difficult to solve. It's difficult to identify the sources of the problem, as Gregor knows well. But also, as Gregor said earlier, if we don't fix it now, it will continue to get worse.
So, of course, one extreme manifestation, and perhaps the most visible one, of the housing crisis is homelessness. Nanaimo, like Victoria and Vancouver and cities across this country, have seen a rapid rise in street homelessness over the past 5 years. In Nanaimo's last survey of homelessness, a vast majority said their number one barrier to finding housing was simple: low income and high rent. Most surveyed also reported living with mental health issues and addictions, and 1/3 specifically reported challenges with an acquired brain injury. Questions on brain injury were only recently added to official surveys of homelessness across the country. At the bottom of a 2023 report on this, it says this: thanks to Kix Sitten, Executive Director of the Nanaimo Brain Injury Society, for being the driving force behind inclusion of this important question on the national survey. And so here she is with us. Thank you so much for being here. Could you speak to what the relationship is between brain injury and homelessness?
It's critical to understand the intersection of brain injury, mental health, substance use, and homelessness. And this may not make great radio, so I apologize, Nahlah, but a show of hands in the audience if you yourself have experienced a brain injury or you know somebody who has experienced a brain injury. That includes concussion, stroke, motor vehicle accidents, sports accidents. So let's just take a look around. Hold your hands up and just have a look around in the audience.
Almost everyone has their hand up.
Almost everyone has their hands up. So we know that brain injury is what's called a silent epidemic. The numbers are significant, and yet we're not talking about it. So I'm really excited that we're here tonight. So if we think about the numbers across Canada, about 165,000 people experience a brain injury in Canada every year, and that leads to about 1.5 million people living with a brain injury in Canada. Now, those numbers are conservative. Why? Because we know that we're not tracking brain injuries, that often concussions go undocumented and untreated. We know that there are certain conditions that lead to brain injury, including intimate partner violence, a huge public health crisis in our communities, and the mechanism of injury is associated with a brain injury. So significant. And then the connection between brain injury and housing. So you can see that cascade of events. If you experience a brain injury and you're no longer able to maintain employment, maintain housing, maintain your relationships, that Craigie talked about the crumbling foundation of the housing crisis. Think about the foundation of your life and how a brain injury would affect that foundation, those critical pieces. So we can see the cascade of events.
After the break, we'll continue our discussion about the housing crisis. Welcome back. We'll continue our discussion of the housing crisis and how it affects the health of our democracy. As we sort of said at the beginning, we're really here to kind of explore ways that how the housing crisis affects our democracy. And so let me ask you this. What do you see as the relationship between the housing and mental health crisis and the health of our democracy?
So I was thinking about our clients who come through our doors and the folks who are able to engage in the programs where they're able to volunteer and engage to give back to our communities. Who are the people who are engaging in these contributions and citizenship? Contribution equals citizenship. And so the folks who are able to contribute in that way are the folks who have some sort of stable housing, supportive families, some kind of income. But the folks who are not, and the people that we support with housing, with mental health supports, with addressing the substance use disorder, those folks don't access those other programs. So without those basic needs, they are excluded from those other opportunities.
Okay. Thank you very much. As we all know, Nanaimo is on the traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nation. By population, it is roughly 2,000 members, correct? Joan Brown is the Chief Administrative Officer of the Nanaimo First Nation, and she joins me now. Thank you for being here. Could you speak to what unique pressures there are? Does the cost and the shortage of housing have for members of the Nanaimo and other Indigenous people in Nanaimo?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Certainly the pressures are not unique to us without a doubt, but we think about, for us, it's not only housing, but it's the other losses that we've experienced. So when we think about the level of poverty, it's not just housing. And for us, it's like trying to restore, reclaim a way of being that really contributes to the overall wellness of our community. So those pressures are immense, especially for the generations that are following. They haven't had the benefit of being with the elders as I have. Like, my parents were the last fluent speakers. That was their first language. So for us, it's a long way back for the young people, not understanding what's required to survive in this kind of environment.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the Nanaimo Nation has worked with the city and the province to create some housing projects. Could you speak to just how effective that is as a solution to some of this?
And what our nation says, and it's really one of the strengths, and everyone's talking about, is taking down those silos and really what it means to have partnerships. BC Housing, without a doubt, understanding our way of being and moving in that direction. The city, of course, creating that space and working together, the school district. Taking down those silos is from an ancestral lens, is really understanding how to work in a meaningful way, drawing strength from both ways of being to produce a strong outcome. And that's the wisdom of the ancestor, walking in two worlds.
Yeah. And of course, there's the practical aspect of this, but there's also just societal thinking about the place of these kinds of projects, but also the place of Indigenous nations among, here. And so could you speak to, how do you even begin to shift the way society looks at this issue from that perspective?
What we talk about often is reconciling with the land. People don't really think about in that context. They just think about housing, putting roofs over their heads. We think about a whole systemic way of approaching things. But in our way of being, if we restore the health of the land, you'll see the magic in returning to the first teacher, the first healer, and really benefiting from the curative properties of the land. That's the cornerstone. That's our way of being, and that's what we try to instill with all of our projects. We say the land walks first. Yeah.
The land walks first. Just tell me a bit more about that.
So with each project, supportive housing, transition housing, it really, really means that we have to include Indigenous plants, so that thinking about the medicinal properties of those plants that individuals can use will be profound. And just finding that way to connect to the land. Everything that we talk about is that connectivity. If we can start there, that's where the true healing begins for all of us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here, Joan. Really appreciate it. My next guest wears a few different hats that are related to all this. He is a refugee resettlement worker, helping refugees start a new life in Canada. He is American, working in Canada and hoping to stay, and is a writer for Strong Towns Nanaimo. So let me start with a very personal question. You're young.
Yes.
You're a relative newcomer who wants to stay. How hard has it been for you to find housing that's affordable?
Well, for me, it's hard, but people here who have networks and connections, we're creative young people. We find ways of co-living. We find workarounds. It's hard. For me, I've found a home with an incredibly cheap room. I would love to move, but an incredibly cheap room.
So some of the people who do have a harder time finding housing are the people you work with, refugees who need to settle here, who are trying to make their way. Just could you talk about, again, the unique challenges that newcomers face in finding secure housing in Nanaimo?
Yeah, absolutely. So just picture your current housing crisis, except you don't understand the culture, you don't like the houses, they feel scary, you don't speak the language, and you just fled a war and your home was destroyed. And you didn't choose to come here, but you had no choice. And now you're told, my house costs what? So there's so many complex factors that feeds into how immigrants have to navigate housing in Nanaimo, and it's worse in Vancouver, but it's hard here.
As part of your work with this organization that you're with, you try to actually change opinions on the need to increase urban density, for example, and to look at creative ways of finding housing solutions. Can you talk about how you do that? What do you do?
Yeah, it's a complex conversation because I think many people, when they think about what a home was for them when they were a kid in the 1950s, 1960s, it was a bungalow, it was cheap, and that's what family housing looks like. That's what, in your mind, affordable housing looked like for you growing up. But that's not what the affordable housing of our generation looks like. It's different. It's townhouses, it's apartments, believe it or not. And for us, it's changing the conversation that Nanaimo is changing. And what outcome do we want? Do we want to preserve these bungalows and the way they look and the imagination of the affordability of past times? Or do we want the outcome of that, which is affordable housing?
And you take that argument into the streets, to the people. How do you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many city opportunities to engage. So we go to city engagements. We go to public hearings. When an affordable housing proposal is being put to the city, we show up. This is when we talk about community engagement and civic democracy. My clients have no clue what's going on. They don't understand what's wrong with us. Why is housing expensive here? It wasn't where they're from.
Yeah.
But for them, it's like, where are the cranes? Why aren't you building housing? Like they're floored. And if you told them the actual reason, oh well, if you have the roofs this way and it needs to be 10.6, 10.5 meters, anything above that, well, you need a variance, so you got to go to the city, and then you got to go through this whole process.
You're talking about the red tape.
Exactly. For them, it's, well, I have more kids, I need more rooms, I need a house with more rooms. Why aren't we building that?
Right.
And so I think it's going out and challenging these perceptions for the positive outcomes that we want to see.
If there were one thing that you could kind of look at or use it as an example from Nanaimo that could be scaled up to offer solutions for the rest of the country for the housing crisis, what would that be? Something that's done here that could be modeled elsewhere.
Yeah, Nanaimo is very pro-housing. I think we've made that connection finally, that yes, we need to change. And now what are the systems that we need to change to encourage that? There's amazing work being done at the city to these ancient design rules from the 90s. We're reforming that. And if you go on our website for the city, it's there, and they'll tell you all about it. And there was community engagement for that. And so Nanaimo has really recognized the depth of the situation. And what's so amazing is we're doing what Vancouver should have done back in the 1990s. And I think it's a long road ahead, and there's more on affordability, but we're making the right choices now. I think there's more to be made, but we're working our way there.
Thank you very much for being here, Louis.
Thank you.
Louis James. Ideas for a Better Canada is a partnership with the Samara Centre for Democracy. To hear even more of those conversations, please listen to CBC Ideas on broadcast or podcast, or visit us at cbc.ca/bettercanada. A big thank you to the CBC Call Out Partnership Program for making this series possible. And thank you for tuning in.